things which we humans routinely split apart. And in the middle of all of that, if with the Bible we believe that there will be a new creation, new heavens and new earth, we believe that it's already been launched with the resurrection of Jesus, so that our belief about what happens to us is held within the much larger picture of our belief about what God has done, is doing, and will do for the whole cosmos. And that's where the picture of the so-called second coming of Jesus fits in. Many Christians get very puzzled about this, as well they might, and there is one entire subculture of movement at the moment, very popular in the States, although it actually started here in this country. Well, there are other bits as well, but the present movement started here, which believe that at the second coming of Jesus, Jesus will appear from the sky, and that all those who belong to Jesus will be snatched up on a cloud, literally, physically, to meet him in the air and to go off somewhere else. This is known popularly as the rapture, the snatching up of people from this world to be taken away somewhere else. I have written about this, and I've written against this, argued against this on the basis of Scripture for many years. And once I wrote an article like that in an American magazine, and in the next issue of the magazine they had all these letters, people cancelling their subscriptions and that sort of thing. But one of them said, "How does Mr. Wright think he's going to get to heaven if he doesn't get raptured?" And I thought, this is weird. In this modern, highly educated age, people really think that heaven is a location within our space-time universe, some way up there. I don't know whether people do this, rather like the people who wrote those funny things about Princess Diana. It's hard to tell what people thought, but that is a gross parody of what Christians actually believe. In the Bible, heaven and earth are not sky and land like that. That's the metaphor. Heaven and earth are the interlocking spheres of God's created reality, and they are not far apart. They are meant to work together. They were right from the very beginning. In the Hebrew imagination, the temple in Jerusalem was the place where heaven and earth actually came together. When you were in the temple, it wasn't as if you were in heaven. You were in heaven. That's where the two spheres intersected. And the New Testament, again and again, says things about Jesus and says things about the Holy Spirit, which strongly imply that where Jesus is and where the Spirit is, there heaven and earth already mysteriously overlap and interlock. That's where we're supposed to live if we're Christians. So it shouldn't be a surprise that at the end God will make new heavens and new earth which come together in that rich, extraordinary mixture. And that when they do that, then, of course, the central feature will be Jesus himself in person. He won't need to come flying around or on a cloud or anything like that. He will be there at the heart of the new creation. He is already, according to Christian teaching, its rightful Lord. This is why many political organizations in the ancient world and in the modern have seen Christians as deeply subversive, because they already give to Jesus the allegiance which totalitarian governments, ancient and modern, claim for themselves. No, says the New Testament, Jesus is Lord, therefore Caesar isn't. Why do we know Jesus is Lord? Because God raised him from the dead. And the ancient scriptural prophecies which the early Christians read made it quite clear that when the King of Israel emerges, the Messiah, when he is vindicated as such, he will be the Lord of the world. That's how New Testament theology works. Now you may say, this is all very well. Maybe I'm blinding you with all sorts of things you never imagined before. And by the way, if you're a regular churchgoer and you're used to singing traditional hymns and praying traditional prayers, a lot of them are wonderful, but particularly in the Victorian period, a lot of the hymns end up with that "so let's all go upstairs to heaven, shall we" stuff, which actually lets the side down big time, because it cuts the nerve of new creation work in the present. It's very interesting in church history, that stuff which was second nature to people a few hundred years earlier, about how God wanted his people actually to be involved in bringing his hope and his justice and his joy to bear on this world, they kind of gave that up in many parts of the Victorian period. It's not as easy as that, I'm oversimplifying, but there was a lot of that. So that instead of talking about resting and then reappearing raised from the dead, people talked about going home, going to heaven as gone to my rest forever and ever. But let me show you how it works. When I was, again, stories from my past, when I was Dean of Lichfield, then when I was Bishop of Durham, one of the places I loved to visit in Lichfield and then in Durham was the stonemason's yard beside the cathedral. They had these stonemasons' yard from the early medieval period when they were building those cathedrals. And the stonemasons in the medieval period would be probably illiterate, and the foreman would come down to the yard and would say, I want you to carve this block of stone with this bit of pattern, I want you to do this bit with this line across like that, and so on and so on. And their job was simply to carve those bits of stone obediently, and then one day the master mason would come and he would collect up all those bits of stone, and somehow, goodness knows how they did it with their old wooden scaffolding, they got all this stone up onto this extraordinary building. And then you imagine the mason standing there and thinking, oh my goodness, that's my little stone up there on the west front or the south transept or wherever it is. And if you'd said to that stonemason when he was hard at his work, what are you doing? He might have said, I'm building a cathedral, but that would be a bit grandiose because actually he wasn't building the cathedral. But he might have said, I'm carving this stone for the cathedral. You get the picture? Now let me tell you. According to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and many other passages, when you are working in tune with the purposes of the Creator God within the present world, in the love of Christ, in the power of the Spirit, you are not building the kingdom in some grandiose way, but you are building for the kingdom. At the end of that great chapter, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul expounds the resurrection, it's one of the longest, it is the longest chapter in our printings of the Bibles. It's one of Paul's longest arguments. You might think, if he's just written this great argument about the resurrection, how we're going to be raised from the dead into God's new world, he might say at the end, well, there you are, since we have this wonderful hope, sit back, relax, it's all going to be wonderful in the future, isn't that fine? He doesn't. What he says in the last verse of that chapter is, therefore, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your work is not in vain. What does he mean, not in vain? He means that the resurrection results in a situation where all that we do in the present time for the kingdom will not be lost. This is a mystery, just as the resurrection itself is a mystery. The idea of new creation is a mystery. We can't prove it mathematically within the old world. As I say, it's the new reality that already in Jesus has burst into our world. But what he means is this. Jesus himself spoke about giving a cup of cold water to someone who believed in him, and that will not go to waste. You won't lose your reward. What it means is that all the work of justice and healing, all the work of education and hope, all the work of the arts, of beauty, of the imagination, bringing things which adorn God's world and the lives of God's people, none of that will be wasted. Somehow, like the stones carved in the stonemason's yard, they will be part of God's new world. This is not something one can prove, it is something I believe in faith. When what we do in the present is not wasted. You see, people often say, oh, what's the fuss to make the world a better place? If we're all going to heaven eventually, then why bother with whether it's global warming or whether it's world poverty or global debt or anything? And the answer is no. Jesus has already been raised from the dead. The new world has already begun. Therefore, don't be fixated about the questions of what exactly heaven will be like or anything like that. That's not the point. The point is God will make his new world in the end, but he's already begun with the resurrection of Jesus, and in the power of the Spirit, you are called not just to be beneficiaries of that new creation, but actually to be agents. Not that we build the kingdom by our own efforts. God builds God's kingdom. He is the master mason. We are called, though, to build for the kingdom. The call of the gospel of Jesus is not just to be saved, but to become people through whom God's rescue operation for the whole creation can actually make significant steps here and now. What you do in the Lord is not in vain. Now, I've spoken for long enough. I've fulfilled my obligation. I said 40 minutes, and that's what I've done. What I'm going to suggest, we're going to have some questions, but often after a session like this, I put quite a lot of stuff on the table in front of you, metaphorically speaking. Let's just take 2 minutes and buzz, turn to your neighbour and say what you found either most exciting or most incomprehensible or most heretical or whatever it may be. And then when you've done that for 2 minutes, hopefully there'll be some questions to come to. So, buzz.
Since the incarnation of Christ. I wondered what your views might be on some takes on some of the early church fathers, I'm thinking of Basil the Great and the other Cappadocians, that might well state that the perfection started since creation itself, and he speaks a lot of so-called unsolved creation, that is not human creation, that the rest of the cosmos is all moving towards this kind of perfection.
Well, yes, I'm not at all an expert on the Cappadocian Fathers. I doff my cap at them, but I basically cut out around 200 AD, so I don't claim any expertise past that point. I think constantly in biblical theology one is saying two things which might seem to pull against each other. One is that what God does in Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of his plan from the beginning of creation. But the other is that actually this is something radically new as well. And expressing those two together, it's a bit like in physics, waves and particles or whatever. We find we need to say them both, even though we find it very difficult to say them both together. However, when we say them both, then all sorts of bits, both of Scripture and of the larger tradition, do seem to make sense. And I think it's very important to say it is not a new creation in the sense that the old creation is thrown away. The new is the rescue, redemption, rebirth, ultimate fulfillment of the old. But as I say, those debates rumble on. Actually, in Pauline scholarship at the moment, we have the same debate in a different mode. So I want to say both and. It is radically new with the resurrection, but the radical new thing is God saying yes to the original intention. Somehow we hold on to both of those. That's a great question, my goodness, yes.
What about, can you say something about recognition and communication of souls in the next life? Will I meet my mother and dad? Will I be able to communicate with them?
Yeah. First question about souls. I think I hardly mentioned souls. And actually, one of the funny things about biblical theology is that the word soul doesn't occur nearly as often as you might think it does. In much Christian tradition, often more indebted to Plato than perhaps it should have been, the soul has played rather a large role. When I was teaching here many years ago, I had a student who wanted to study Buddhism, and so I sent her to Professor Gombrich at the Oriental Institute to study Buddhism, and he asked her to compare the Buddhist to the Christian notions of the soul, and she said she didn't know what the Christian notion of the soul was. And he wrote me a sharp little note saying, you've been teaching this young woman for 18 months and she doesn't know what the Christian notion of the soul is. I said, that's because we've been studying the Bible. It's not an important concept. It comes in later. I'm happy to use the word soul, but only heuristically. That is to say, as a way of denoting who we are in the presence of God. I use it holistically. That is to say, soul is me in the presence of God, just like body is me in this world and present to other people, etc., etc. The danger comes when we think that we all have a platonic immortal soul which pre-existed and post-existed. I don't see that in the New Testament. So the question then is, when we talk about who we are immediately after death and before resurrection, the New Testament gives us very, very little help with that, and rather implies that our preoccupation with it is perhaps misplaced. We are preoccupied with it. We do want to know those things. Wisdom of Solomon says, the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and there shall no torment touch them. It's one of the few places in the wider biblical tradition, obviously that's in the Apocrypha, which uses that language. The question is, will we know one another? It seems to me very clear in the resurrection, yes, all the people we have known and loved who are part of that resurrection world, of course, because the great thing about the resurrection body is that it's God's vision of who you really are. It's more you than you are at the moment, as it were. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says things which lead me to say, if somebody you know has been very sick, you say, poor old so-and-so is just a shadow of his former self. The truth of the resurrection is, if you're in Christ and indwelt by the Spirit, you are just a shadow of your future self. There is a real you which is even more like you than you are at the moment. So of course we will recognize, and we will be thrilled to see these people whom we have loved truly the people that they were meant to be. That's a wonderful prospect. How that will be in the intermediate state, we are not given any clues. But what we are given is the assurance of the love of God and the utter goodness of his purposes for us. And I think there's a sense of letting go. There's a sort of humility. The danger is we want to cling on to things we have enjoyed here. Please, can I still enjoy them hereafter? And part of death, it seems to me, is being prepared to say, okay, nothing in my hand I bring. I don't own this life. It's not my possession. I have to say, okay, it is God's, and God can do whatever he wants with it. And then the good things that we are to be given are the good things that we are to be given. It's difficult to say that. I wouldn't like to say that in a funeral sermon, but it seems to me, since this isn't a funeral sermon, it may be the time is a little bit. Okay. Sorry, long answer, but an important question. I've got about 5 more hands coming. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, you said.
You alluded a few times to Revelation 21, the great city coming down onto the earth. I've always been intrigued with the image that flows out of that, about 20 verses later, about the glory of the nations being brought into this city. Do you think we can know, what is the glory of the nations there? Is it something cultural?
Or? The whole book of Revelation is, of course, a wonderful collage of symbols. At the beginning you get the Lamb who is also a lamb and who has all these horns and eyes and goodness knows what. And there's a sort of sense of do not try this at home about this. It's not meant to be taken literally. We're to understand how the symbolic universe works that way. And so there are lots of things about Revelation 21 and 22 which we have to say, this is a signpost pointing to a reality which otherwise we couldn't have any language for. Don't mistake the signpost for the reality, you know, like streets paved with gold and so on. What would the point of that in that world? But the idea of the nations bringing their treasure into it is, of course, a rich Old Testament notion of when God does for Israel what God is going to do, then the nations will come in to be blessed. And there is a sense in Revelation 21 of this city whose gates stand open night and day. There's no enemy to defend against. Anyone is welcome to come in. And then equal and opposite is that a river flows out of the city, and that on either side of the river the tree of life grows, bearing fruit year round, and it says the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. That's fascinating. It's as though the new city is not a tableau, it is a project. And I suspect we've hardly begun to get our minds around that, because we don't often reflect, I think, on the new city. But if we do, we think of it as a static thing where, oh yeah, we'll get there and that'll be it. You know, just everyone happy, period. And no, God is the creator. God is the God of generous love. So his new world will be a new project. And it'll be a project of great glory and joy and all sorts of things. So, as I've often said, these are signposts pointing into a fog, the bright mist of God's new world. The signposts are true, even though they don't give us an exact pictorial representation of what we'll find when we get there. Who was next? Yes, you, sir. Yeah.
Just wondering, one of the tenets of the faith is the bodily resurrection.
Yes.
In what sense would it be different to what you have just explained?
That's what I've been talking about, bodily resurrection. But so I may not be getting you at the point of your question. The resurrection is the new body which we are promised, which is mysterious. Paul knows it's mysterious. John knows it's mysterious. It will be the real us, and it will be really a body.
It's the fundamentals of teaching of the church, the body resurrection.
Yeah.
I mean, trying to explain that, we make the distinction, and of course we would make the distinction of either two separate worlds, or the teaching is that it is the body resurrection. The teaching never says that it is two different worlds.
But God, the difficulty is that ever since the Western Middle Ages, when the idea of heaven and hell and so on took over from the idea of new creation, then it's been harder and harder for people to imagine what this new body is going to be doing if the ultimate destination is a sort of Platonic heaven. You don't need a body in a Platonic heaven. I was once doing a radio show where somebody phoned in and said, I'm intending to go to heaven when I die, and I certainly don't want to take this stupid old body with me. And if your vision of heaven is a disembodied reality, then the phrase in the creed, the resurrection of the body, simply must be a very bizarre metaphor. The trouble is, it never was a metaphor. But in order to understand what it means, we today need to recover the idea of the new heavens and the new earth, the whole new world, because it makes sense then to have new bodies in that new world. Does that answer your question? More or less. Yes, good, thank you. Yes, and then yeah.
To follow up on that, I was on a parish placement speaking to a parishioner with quite severe facial deformity, and he was concerned that in a bodily resurrection with a new body that was intended to be as it should be, he wouldn't look as he did then, and therefore wouldn't be recognisable as himself, because that's who he was.
It's the sort of question, interestingly, very similar questions to questions people ask of the early fathers, and interestingly the early rabbis as well, because they too taught bodily resurrection. And they had various ways of getting at that, ways of saying yes to recognition, but yes also to complete healing, so that that which is at the moment a sign of sadness and shame and deformity, whatever you want to call it, will become something glorious. And the model for that is, of course, the mark of the nails in Jesus' hands, that those were signs of his suffering, of his shameful, barbaric death, and they became instead marks of love. There's a wonderful moment in John's Gospel where it says he showed them his hands and his side, and then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. You bet they were. these are marks which say, it goes all the way back to Isaiah, I have graven you on the palms of my hands. You know, so that the things of which people might be sad and ashamed in this life can be transformed in the new world, so as to be somehow both, insofar as we need recognition, they will be recognizable, and glorious. And of course the Church's great tradition of martyrdom, the wounds of the martyrs are the signs and badges of their glory. How much this is metaphorical and how much it's concrete, it's hard to say. But the main thing is it's a challenge to trust that God the Creator is not going to mess it up. Yeah.
Thank you. Within the world to come and everything put right, can you comment on Daniel 12:2 and how we understand those who wake to everlasting shame and reproach?
Yeah, in Daniel and in some other passages, in John 5 for instance, it says that not only those who belong to Christ, and not only God's people will be raised from the dead, but also, whether you want to call them the wicked or whatever, those who have refused will also be raised from the dead. And the fathers debated this on and off, and some of them insisted that since people had sinned in the body, they needed to be punished in the body, therefore they had to be raised for that to happen. That raises all sorts of quite difficult issues, and in the New Testament it seems to me that actually, again, it's like waves and particles. Both things seem to be taught. In Romans 8, the resurrection is clearly something which is promised to people who belong to the Messiah, people who are Jesus people. Paul doesn't in Romans, as far as I can see, talk about the resurrection of unbelievers, of whether you call them the wicked or whoever. So it's as though these two are feelings forward into the strangeness of God's future. I don't think there's an easy way to reconcile that, to be honest. If there was, I wish I'd found it, because I would have said it in a previous book, but I didn't, so I didn't. But I think what it's an affirmation of is something to do with the goodness of creation, and that even when people go wrong, they still have to take responsibility within a created order for their selves, the selves that they have become. How that translates out would demand more than I have so far done in terms of, I don't like, often when I talk about this sort of stuff in America, the first question is, what about hell? I'm delighted that that has not been so here today. Some people get fixated on hell, which is very unhealthy. I'm not a universalist. I do believe it is possible for people finally to say no to God, and you know, for that to stick, as it were. But you would then have to have some form of how you articulate that in order then to get meaning out of Daniel 12. Thanks. Difficult one, yes. Let's have a question over this side of the room, for having had 5 over here. Yes.
How much is the body, the resurrection of the body and the new earth and heaven exclusively belong to Christianity and Judaism, or how much is borrowed from philosophy or the...
Do you mean the ideas of it? Yeah. The idea of new creation and resurrection comes when you get a strong view of God as creator, as I said, and a strong view of God as judge. So you do find it in some bits of Islam as well. I'm not at all an expert on Islam, and I'm sure there are people in this room, perhaps over yourself, who know a lot more about it than I do. Islam can use the language of resurrection. I'm not quite sure whether it chases it through in the same way that the early Christians and the Jewish rabbis did. But it is, I mean, if you don't believe that the present world is the good creation of a good God, then why would you want to renew it? You just want to get rid of it. For Plato, it's a world of sort of shadows and insubstantial things, and the soul is the real reality, so that's what we've got to go for. So, yes, I mean, Christianity sees itself as the place where everything in Judaism was taken and made concrete in the person of Jesus. I mean, it isn't a replacement. Jesus is the Jew par excellence, and Gentile Christians like myself clinging to the coattails of the Jew par excellence, and we must never forget that. But then, insofar as Islam has borrowed from and modified bits of Judaism and Christianity, it's not surprising we find it there too. There are all sorts of theories that some of these ideas go back to Zoroastrianism and so on. The trouble is we don't know the Zoroastrian texts in the way that we would like to. It's very difficult to date such information as we have, and sometimes I suspect that people have said that in order to try to diminish Christianity and Judaism and Islam by saying, oh, well, it was all some odd